the Obama administration in terms of trade is doing what I think the Bush administration did really well. And this is sort of this Orwellian language and stealing words. And do you guys remember healthy forests and clear skies and all of those things that were like pro-pollution and pro-cutting down trees? Well, the Obama administration stole our language. They talk about a new trade model. They talk about a 21st century trade agreement. They talk about high standards. But those don't mean the same thing when they talk about high standards. So just be careful of knowing what words mean when you hear them. Okay, so basically this just says it largely looks like NAFTA. They've added a few bells and whistles to make it look like the new model, but most of those new chapters that they're adding, they've told us, aren't really enforceable. So you can have a chapter on small and medium enterprises and say small and medium enterprises are going to really benefit from this deal. But unless you have somehow real rules that help small enterprises compete with Citibank and GE and Caterpillar and Walmart, it's not going to happen. It's just pretty words. So a couple of very specific things. Buy America. How many people are familiar with Buy America policies? Okay. So in our trade agreements from NAFTA forward, including at the WTO, we make these commitments called government purchasing commitments. And what they do is they obligate us to treat those trading partners as American companies for the purposes of Buy America legislation, unless they take a specific exception. So what the U.S. has taken specific exceptions for are basically federal highway projects and transit projects. So you can generally be assured if a highway project or a transit project is happening with federal money, it's American iron, it's American steel. However, you can have an example of California, which turned down federal money because they didn't want to buy American. They wanted to use a Chinese contractor with Chinese steel, so they didn't use federal money. When Buy American applies to other projects where we haven't taken exceptions, so building a new courthouse, building a new federal building, they can apply Buy American to it, but American will count as any country we have a free trade agreement with or any country that has signed the procurement agreement at the WTO. So what does that mean? You're trying to create jobs in your city, in your state, in the country, because our economy is really, really bad. Well, things are going really well in Australia, and Australia can come in and bid, and they can take all that money. So President Obama was actually criticized that about a third of his big stimulus bill, the American Reinvestment Recovery Act, went overseas. Well, it went overseas because we already have these commitments. So, and again, this impacts not just construction projects or buying paper or buying equipment, but it affects services contracts. So if you have a government that's actually outsourcing rather than insourcing and providing a service with public employees, you still at least could capture those jobs for U.S. workers, potentially, if your state has a policy of Buy New York or Buy America. But if New York signs up to the TPP, and the TPP contains these provisions, what it means is the Australian, New Zealand, Vietnamese, Malaysian, Chilean, whatever, all those companies can compete equally. So those jobs, especially if they're call center jobs, helping folks get social services, they can be gone. So in terms of employment, are people familiar with the concept of state-owned enterprises? So this is where the government owns all or a portion of a particular business. It doesn't happen a lot in the United States unless you're talking about public services, like the New York Transit Authority. It's really, really common in most other countries and very common in Asian countries. And they compete commercially. So if you're talking about a large Chinese telecom company, a large Chinese steel company, electronics, they're often actually totally owned or partially owned by the Chinese government. So they can compete differently. The Chinese government can say you don't pay taxes. You get a loan which you don't have to pay back, or you get a loan with a 1% interest rate. Or you get your inputs to build your widget discounted or free from this other state-owned enterprise. So they can really compete unfairly and drive, private companies that have to pay the market cost of capital and the market cost of wages and the market cost of inputs out of business. And it's not that countries shouldn't have the right to be involved in their own economies. The problem for American workers comes if those state-owned enterprises come invest on American soil and set up shop down the street from a U.S. company and purposely, compete in a predatory way to drive the competitors out of business. Because you will end up, if that happens, with one of two things. You have a monopsony, like a single buyer for labor then, just the state-owned enterprise, because they've driven everybody else out of business. Or they drive the American companies out of business, and then they take their money and pack up and go home and take the jobs back to the country they came from, and then we've got a whole devastated sector. So there should be rules to cover that don't tell countries how to run their economy, but do set rules for fair competition. Public services. So a lot of people think, well, my job's safe because you can't trade it away. That's not true anymore. You certainly can trade it away. Number one, when we lose manufacturing, who's paying the property taxes for that factory anymore? Perhaps nobody. That's a loss of revenue. What happens to all those workers who either have no jobs or lesser jobs? Well, that's lost revenue for income taxes. In addition, we talked about how the government services can be outsourced and competed overseas. So there are lots of ways. If you're cutting government revenue, government's going to say, oh, austerity. Let's cut public service workers. Let's do furloughs. Let's get rid of the pensions. All these things that are already happening can happen more.